Kurt's moving out was very well organised, and John was very quiet about it. There was no argument, no shouting or crying or begging. It was all conducted without any words. For Max it seemed strange. He knew that in his own breakup months ago in Britain, he had gone through a similar way, but is this the way that adults now deal with breakups? Quietly accepting the inevitable, perhaps when people get older and realize and accept when a relationship has ended, there is no more to say, no more to do. For Max and John, there was another problem. There had been problems with the house itself. The Belgian government had tightened the rules over the renting of houses and apartments. John had already made a complaint about Moselstraat to the housing authorities because it didn't come up to the new regulations. An inspector had come round and looked through the house and concluded that the house didn't reach the standard where the owner would take rent from a third party. It was just not up to spec. The house had become damp, with black mould creeping down one of the outer walls. This mould appeared to be worse in Max's bedroom, and had got to the stage where the outer wall was now covered in black. The house could also be cold because it had a large window in the lounge and other rooms, and they were not double glazed. In winter you could feel the cold air coming through the glass. The heating was ancient. It ran on oil. It was expensive to run. It cost a fortune to keep the house even reasonably warm during the months. Put simply, the house needed a complete renovation to bring it up to standard and become more energy efficient. John had contacted the owner and he had completely ignored the report. He wasn't about to spend any money on the property as it would cost a small fortune to put everything correct. In answer to this, John had refused to pay the rent, which resulted in an argument and the owner threatening legal action and eviction. Thankfully, the social services in Tavern came to their rescue and backed John completely. They would have to move out of the house and find somewhere new. The owner would then be forced, if he wanted to continue renting the property, to spend a lot of money to bring the house up to legal standard, or he would be refused permission to rent out the place in the future. John had found a new apartment and the two of them prepared to move in. The only problem was that Wharton was now old. His breed didn't have a long life and he was now showing his age. He was finding it difficult to walk, and although he did appear to be happy and content, it was obvious that he wouldn't really last much longer. Unfortunately, the new apartment didn't allow pets, so Kurt arranged to take him to his new apartment in the Alps. They knew that Kurt dearly loved Wotan and that he would be well taken care of. So Kurt collected Wotan and took him away while Max and John moved into their new apartment. John and Max had spent the last week in Moselstraat packing boxes and making sure everything was ready for the move. The heating had gone off because he had refused to pay for any more heating oil. Max had an old electric fan heater that he bought years ago and never used. It was the only heating that they had to keep warm, so they both moved into the lounge and kept the electric heater close. The rest of the house was cold and dark. They moved their bedding into the lounge and now slept on the sofas. In Max's room, the black mould was now covering all the walls, and he felt that it was too damp to stay there. Even the bed was covered in this damp. So for about 2 weeks they kept warm in the lounge, huddled next to each other, huddled over the only heating in the house, the electric fan heater. The authorities had declared Moselstraat as unsuitable for rented habitation, and so were responsible for making sure that the two of them could find another place to live. This was the first time that the social services had become interested in John. They did not have his medical history, but their representatives had made aware that John needed special help, and so they did everything they could to support the two of them. This would become an important relationship that John developed with the Social Security Services, and a relationship that would stretch their resources. They were there to help, and they were not about to allow two people in Tavern to be made homeless because of the state of the house. The day came when John and Max moved out. Thankfully, John still had his contacts, and he was able to make sure that the move was handled by a professional house moving company. They were moving into a 2-bedroom apartment in the center of Tavern. John had found the place after visiting a series of other properties. Even though he was not well, he knew enough about properties and where he was prepared to live. It was a fact about John that he could still act as if he was normal, especially when he was pushed. He still had the ability to argue with organizations and companies and was able to get the best deal possible. It helped that he'd maintained the ability to speak fluent French, and more importantly, he could swear in French when someone didn't give him what he wanted. This was the strange thing about John's condition. On a personal level, he was still a frightened little boy, afraid to be alone. But when faced with a problem, his keen intelligence was there, and he was not frightened to take on anyone who got in his way. Max was amazed, surprised by this ability where John could still fight his way through a problem. It did tire him, and he would be exhausted after any encounter, but the true John, the real John, was still there. He still had that smile in his eyes, he still had that fight, and he was still able to bend the world to what he wanted. The cost was hard. Max could see the toll this took on his health. John was still ill. No one could see this, though. All they saw was this English-speaking expat who could launch into the most fluent French whenever he chose to do so. Max admired him, not because of what he achieved, but because he saw his friend here, in front of him, refusing to give in, refusing to be a cripple, refusing to accept his disability, refusing to allow life to grind him down and take away the person he was. Max saw, at this time, that John was there, the John that he remembered. He was a fighter. He was an exceptional person. He was refusing, day after day, to allow whatever disability had to control him. This was the John he knew and loved. This was why he stayed. This was why he had not left when he had the chance. It was because John was a fighter. He would never give in. He wouldn't allow anything to get in the way of what he wanted. Max admired this. It taught him one thing. You have to fight for who you are and what you want. The move into the new apartment went quickly and smoothly. It was in the center of town rather than out on the edges where most of Strat had been. Also, they didn't have a car now, so it was convenient for the local shops and cafes. The apartment was modern, with double-glazed windows, a modern heating system. It was much smaller and easier to maintain than the 3-bedroom house that they had just left. There were 2 bedrooms and a small balcony, which could be accessed from one of the bedrooms. John chose a larger bedroom, claiming that it was his as he'd found the apartment. Max's bedroom was a good size, so he was quite happy with it. There was a large lounge where the sofas fitted neatly, and an area at the far end that became the dining area. In addition, there was a separate kitchen and a bathroom. It was ideal for the two of them to live there in comfort. Life would now be very different when compared to their previous life. Max's contract had come to an end, and so he was out of work. He still had some money left after the sale of his house, but either way it was going to be tough paying the bills. The social security system provided some help so they could live reasonably well. Kurt too kept in contact, although now he was settling into his new place in Aalst. He would send photos of Wotan, who was now getting weaker and weaker through old age. He appeared to spend most of his days now asleep in his bed. Kurt didn't think that he would last much longer. He had reached the limit of his lifespan, and as such was on borrowed time. Max was surprised that Kurt and John were now getting on very well. Perhaps it was a matter of not being able to live together and not being able to live apart. Perhaps it was just love, and the separation took off the stress of their relationship. Kurt would occasionally come across in his car and take John to the local large supermarket so that he could do a big shop without having to carry heavy bags home. John was improving day by day, and his past days of wildness appeared to be behind him. He was calmer and more determined to get back to living a real life. For Max, Life was easier for him now that they had moved. John was easier to get on with, although they did sometimes have arguments, but that was only natural. He did see through a change in John, in that his memory was getting worse and worse. Not dramatically. He could still function, and he could still forget names and places. He was also becoming more dependent on Max. He would often look to Max for support, and didn't like to go out on his own. He was also jealous if Max was speaking to someone else. Max was not only John's closest friend, but he also realized that he was becoming John's carer. To the outside world, everything was perfectly normal, but Max knew he was different. Max knew the truth. He didn't mind it. It was the first time in his life that someone had really relied on him, someone who needed him to be there, someone who needed his unconditional support and friendship. For the two of them, life was becoming quiet and regulated. It was a big change from the chaos at Mosselstraat. Karen was gone, Kurt was gone, and Wotan was coming to the end of his life. Gone were the days when they were at the centre of attention and people would seek them out. Also gone were the invitations to receptions in Brussels. John had been forgotten. There were a few people who kept in touch through social media, but they were few and far between now. Max had his friends, but many of those expats who had finished their time in Brussels and had either moved on to new jobs or had returned home. He began to realize that his friends in Belgium were fewer and fewer, although he did have a number of outstanding invitations from around the world. If ever he had the time and money, he could spend the rest of his life visiting old friends across the world. Still, life now was quiet and relaxing. John and Max were now living together in their new apartment. There were still arguments over Mosselstraat, but John refused any of these as the house had been declared unsuitable for renting, and as such he didn't owe the owner anything. Kurt was still keeping in touch. One day he phoned up and John took the call. Wotan was now seriously ill, and he felt that it was time to take him to the vet. He had become old and ill, and his strength had left him. Kurt asked John if he wanted to go with him and say goodbye to Wotan. Max could also go, but he turned down the offer. At the back of his mind, he thought it would be a good time for Kurt and John to be together, perhaps for the last time. Also, he'd been very close to Wotan ever since he had brought him home as a puppy, and the thought of having to say goodbye to his old friend was more than he could bear. He shouldn't have felt so emotional about it. He knew that. Wotan was a dog and he was old. He was past his time, but the thought of watching him die was just too much for him. He didn't want to go. Kurt came around to the new apartment in his car and John went with him to the vet surgery. He knew what was going to happen and he had wanted to be with Kurt for these last moments together. Max stayed behind in the apartment. John returned a couple of hours later. He was holding Wotan's collar. The vet had put him to sleep. He was quiet and thoughtful. They both realized it was someone else who had gone from their lives. Their family that they had created at Mosselstraat no longer existed. Wotan was gone, and so was Tosca. Karen had gone, and now Kurt was living far away from them. For John and Max, they realized that they were the only ones left from those days. They were together, but life would now be so much different. Life had moved on, and they were going to have to make the best of it. They were going to have to rely on each other if they were going to make it, if they were going to have to find a new life. There is one thing, though, said Max, looking at John, holding Wotan's collar. He always knew he was loved. Wotan always knew that he was loved. In this life, it's the most that any of us can hope for.